Well, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are listening to this webinar on the planet or whether you're listening to it recorded later on. But thanks for joining us today. I've got a great group of people here together to talk about the work of the Ransomware Task Force, a really important effort that has been going on for the last few months. So I'll let the various panelists give a quick introduction. I'm Michael Daniel. I'm the president and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance and one of the co-chairs of the task force. Phil?
Yeah, thanks for doing this today, Michael, and thanks for having me. I'm Philip Reiner. I'm the CEO and co-founder of the Institute for Security and Technology. We're a West Coast-based think tank that's focused on security and technology issues.
Great. Megan?
Thanks, Michael, for having me. My name is Megan Stiefel. I'm the Executive Director for Americas at the Global Cyber Alliance, a international nonprofit organization dedicated to reducing cybersecurity risk through practical solutions.
Great, thanks. John?
Thank you, Michael, and hello, everyone. I'm John Davis, Vice President of Public Sector at Palo Alto Networks and one of the Ransomware Task Force co-chairs. Been at Palo Alto Networks almost 6 years, but prior to that, 35 years in the U.S. military.
Great, thanks, John. And Michael?
Thank you, Michael, for hosting, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Michael Phillips. I'm the head of claims at the cyber insurance firm Resilience and one of the co-chairs of the task force.
Great. Well, thanks, everyone. So we'll jump right into the issues. So I think, one of the things that the report talks a lot about is ransomware as a national security threat. And I think the first place to start is, what are the implications of ransomware being such a threat? And I mean, we normally think of ransomware as a criminal activity, so isn't it a little unusual to think about criminal activity as a national security threat? Go ahead, whoever wants to jump in on that one. Megan, I saw you come off first.
Yeah.
Sure, I think several of us were at the NSC together, including with you, Michael. So among the benefits of, or I would say it's a benefit to have something designated as a national security threat, because you're then able to exercise and have access to a range of instruments of national power, including thinking about the ability to collect additional intelligence on this activity. Before I kick it over to Phil, as the former DOJ person in the room, so to speak, I would say, no, it's actually not that unusual to have criminal activity considered a national security threat. We can think about counterterrorism. And so, in fact, we were some may disagree, but I would say we were pretty successful in using criminal investigative means to eliminate a lot of, but not all of the terrorism threat, particularly with respect to Al-Qaeda.
Okay.
And just to literally just to reinforce what Megan said, I think Megan's spot on. I think it is as clear as day to everyone who was involved in the task force and everyone who's out there in the community who's working on this every day, that this rises to that level, that this is no longer just an economic nuisance. It's no longer just a petty cybercrime. The threshold has been crossed. And therein, what at least what we understood from those on the task force, what we understand from our previous experience in government, once you actually are able to say that it is not just a cybercrime, that it is an actual national security threat, you have the ability to then task resources. And so you see this already beginning to happen at the Department of Justice with kind of the prioritization. That has practical implications. There are people in the field, for instance, who were already working on this. And as we heard through the task force process, they do great work, but they don't have all the resources they need. They don't have the prioritization from the top down that they can actually put ransomware at the front end of the things they have to focus on. So being able to understand that threshold, there's also other things within the national security apparatus that need to have that sort of understanding, whether it's increasing its prioritization on the NPIF, the national priority list for the intelligence community, as Megan said, or if you're over at Treasury or elsewhere within the interagency, putting ransomware higher on the list of priorities allows for more people, more dollars to be dedicated against it, which I think the task force's top line assertion was what was needed, right? Was that great stuff happening out there, but there has got to be a greater level of focused, coordinated, prioritized resource effort here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Michael, just to add, on a personal level, the reason that we all agree that this has crossed a threshold and become a national security threat is one of the reasons that I wanted to join the task force in the first place, and probably a motivation for many of us who were former, served in government roles. But for me, the reason that this is so different and has changed over the years is because of the level of impact that this is having now on, it's the impacts are tangible, they're serious, and they're out of control. They're affecting, people's lives and livelihoods. They are affecting critical infrastructure on a massive scale. And so the impacts to me are part of the reason that this has crossed that line. The other reason is because of the nexus with nation states. Now, national security issues don't always have to equate to nation state involvement, like in the case of terrorism, or necessarily involve a military response, because there are many other levers of national powers to use. But the nation state, non-nation state nexus, I find alarming, especially when the impact is potentially of the magnitude of what we used to call in government as significant consequences. And the reason that this bothers me so much is because non-state actors, their motivations can be suspect, their skills can be questionable. There is a high opportunity for miscalculation and mistakes. And so I believe that, it is, even as a norm of responsible behavior, I believe this should be important for all responsible nations to try to get better control over, because of this nexus with state and non-state actors.
Yeah, and I think the other piece to me that is really quite important about sort of that designation as a national security threat, right, is it also allows for much greater integration of capabilities across the government. It means that, you can put this on the agenda for the National Security Council, right? And you can use that coordination mechanism to actually drive government work. But I also think it's important for getting the private sector more involved, right? It's not just to the government. It's like the, companies and the private sector will respond in different ways as well, right? And you'll get exactly what we saw with this task force, right? We had 80 something people from, a whole bunch of different range of almost that many companies from all sorts of different places put a lot of time and effort into this report, which is not normal. So, I have to give IST a lot of credit for being able to assemble that group. So that was, I think, really, really important, in and of itself.
Yeah, Michael, if I could jump in there on the private sector action, understanding the scope of the problem, like General Davis was just outlining, that it's attacking critical infrastructure, that nation states are serving as safe havens for, or worse, for these sophisticated ransomware syndicates, is one aspect of it. But the call to action that the IST's task force has been able to put forward for the private sector, I think has been met. And it's been met because private sector actors increasingly understand, corporations, insurers, financial institutions, increasingly understand this is not an isolated incident that a company may struggle with in isolation, but something that that needs to be destigmatized. Sunlight needs to be on it, and all of the whole of government in conjunction with the civil society and the private sector need to be addressing.
Could I just add on to what Michael said? I think that's really important, because this, cyber threats have been this mysterious thing to most people, and they haven't had it impact their lives, except maybe when their credit card or personal information was stolen, but it hasn't been of anything of real significance. Ransomware has changed that. People's kids in schools are affected, people's police stations, local government, hospitals. This has made the threat very real. And I think that the ability to garner public support around this issue is also going to drive a much more holistic approach from all the relevant players, including private sector.
Yeah, no, I think that's very right. I think one of the things that I'm very proud of the work we did on the report. I think it's it's really a great compilation of work. But it is a fair criticism to read that report and look through it and say, oh, great, another interagency working group. Oh, look at that, they're proposing a framework. You know, it's a reasonable criticism to say that there's a lot of stuff in the report that's not new. So, you know, what makes these ideas useful as a way to combat ransomware? And maybe Phil, I'll just start with you.
I'm more than happy to jump on that. You know, as a recovering bureaucrat, you can take me out of the interagency, but you can't take the interagency out of me, right? I think one of the most important pieces here, look back at last fall, and when we really saw kind of this tidal wave hitting healthcare, and you know, the ever increasing sector, education, manufacturing, logistics is hitting everybody, and everyone in the community has known that ransomware has been a problem for years, but it's kind of almost reached a crescendo, and it was almost a clarion call when you realize when a hospital system's down for 3 weeks, people are going to die. And we have resources that can be brought to bear on this at the national level, right? But that coordination wasn't really happening. And so to a certain extent, I would agree that a lot of what perhaps is in the recommendations harks back to things that were out there, calls for them to be refined, calls for them to be better distributed. But at the same time, it asks and demands really for a greater level of coordinated effort, which is not what was pre-existing. I think that actually is a significant departure, where I would argue in not too far in the recent past, the argument was, no, this is industry's responsibility. And that's something we heard as we began to put the task force together. This doesn't rise to the level. This is actually something that industry, municipalities, this is their responsibility. They need to take the steps necessary to protect themselves. I think, as John was beginning to allude to earlier, we know of companies that even that are incredibly well defended are still getting hit and unable to push back. The adversary is retooling in the midst of an attack, and is still being able to seize assets within a company. So I think there needs to be, and this is why we did this, there needs to be a coordinated interagency type effort, because you need all of these moving parts to be happening at the same time if you're really going to see a change in the trajectory. You need someone who's going after a target list of these guys at the same time that those companies are being given the tools they need in order to better protect themselves. And right now, there's not a great enough level of coordinated effort to do that. So that is, I think, a significant departure from what was already there.
Michael, I agree with everything Phil said. And we often said in the task force discussions that, you know, this report and our work wasn't meant to belittle any of the work that's come before us. We mean to stand on the shoulders of those who have done all these good things. But let's face it, it hasn't worked. What's been done so far, overall, there have been some successes in small pockets here and there, but it hasn't worked. So the difference is what we're calling for is a different approach. You know, a full court press to put all these pressure points in place in a way that truly makes a difference, and the involvement of the broad array of participants that are required to do that.
If I could jump in, you know, one thing became clear in the task force's deliberations is a consensus that there's no silver bullet. So, you know, yes, some of the recommendations that that the task force put forward have been put forward in other fields, but I'm also quite proud of our work, and I think we surveyed the entirety of the field. The problem, we recognize that the problem requires that kind of comprehensive action, and I tried to identify throughout the life cycle of ransomware attacks, throughout the kill chain or the payment chain, every intervention opportunity, so that way policymakers and the private sector were both in the best possible position to take those intermediate steps that taken together can really bend the risk curve.
I'd also add that, and I could be wrong, I might be suffering from a memory lapse, but this is the first time we've had strategies and worked to advance a national strategy on cybersecurity, but we haven't taken a piece of that, I don't think, in the past. So I think this is the first time where we've said we're going to tackle ransomware as opposed to data breaches, which ransomware could be a result of a data breach, or data breach could be a result of ransomware. But so I think that's also what's kind of new here. And so this ability to bring, as everyone else has said, to pull the strings together in ways that we did in some, to harken again back to the counterterrorism space, where you're looking at all of these tools that you can bring together to try and have a significant impact to really deter and disrupt the business model.
And I think it's also, oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, John.
Well, I was just going to add, it's also important to recognize that in the task force, our discussions, we've been very realistic about what it is we're trying to accomplish. And we're not saying we're going to solve ransomware. We're saying we're going to bring it into a more manageable risk along the lines of other risks that are managed better today through a comprehensive risk management framework. Maybe not a perfect example, but credit card fraud might be one example of something that we've learned to live with, and we've built that into the system, but it's not something that is existential to, you know, our ability to advance as a nation as this is beginning to impact.
Yeah, and I would argue that, you know, the fact that, for example, the report calls so strongly for diplomatic engagement, and that it calls for, you know, an interagency working group, we know that those things can work. I mean, that's the other piece, is that, yeah, they're not new ideas necessarily, but we also know that that's how the government can get stuff done. And we've seen it work. And I think that was what we were also drawing on from our backgrounds, is that we know that when the government actually uses those tools, it can accomplish more of what it, you know, what it sets out to do. And so I think that just because, you know, not every single idea is completely brand new in the report, that's actually a good thing, right? Because it means that we actually know how to go implement these recommendations.
And Michael, if I could jump in here, I'm harking back to a moment when there was a member on the task force who, as we were talking about potential solutions, they were somewhat irritated. They were like, "Really, you're going to propose a task force? That's it? That's your solution? That's what you can come up with?" I think what's really important here, though, is that the report, yes, we think that there needs to be a bureaucratic level of coordination here. There needs to be international coordination, diplomatic engagement, financial system pressure at an international scale. But those task forces that we recommend are also given very clear recommendations as to what they should be doing, which I think is different. Those task forces have been asked to have all tools of national power at their fingertips. So that includes the diplomacy piece, but it also includes financial action. It also includes going after the infrastructure, going after the bad guys themselves, having actual target lists so that they're coordinating with the private sector so that they can work together to go after these things together, sharing signals, etc. So I do think, and that's what we talked about on the task force, because it's you know, it's sharp criticism. Don't give me a solution that just says stand up a group. Well, okay, so what's the group going to do? And I think that those levels of details that are in the recommendation, I think, is actually really what came out of the discussion, because we had such great people in the task force.
Yeah, and I think I want to pull on that thread a little bit too, because what's also interesting is, you know, if you look through the list of companies that participated, while it was a pretty broad range, I mean, there was a very heavy representation from, you know, cybersecurity companies, technology companies, others in that same field. And so you might have expected a report that was much heavier focused on like technology controls and, you know, my favorite, the snort flabulator, like, you know, go out and buy the snort flabulator and put it on your network. It'll flabulate the snorks and really protect you from, you know, all the ransomware. But, you know, you don't see those kinds of recommendations in the report. And so I think that's a really interesting aspect of, you know, the situation. And, you know, I want to talk a little bit about sort of why that kind of fell out. Much more of the report is about, you know, process and structure and things like, I mean, yes, there are some technical pieces of those, but that's not where the, you know, vast weight of the report ended up.
Yeah, Michael, I've got a couple of thoughts about the role of technology, obviously, but there's a place for this discussion to be had in very specific details, and that's the in my opinion, one of the most important but least sexy parts of this entire set of recommendations. And that's the development of this international practical framework of the best that can be made available to all the right people and all the right organizations so that they can take action of it. And what we recommended in that was something along the lines of what the NIST did with the cybersecurity framework, and developing something very broad that was widely adopted, not just in the US, but internationally, and became kind of a model for cybersecurity standards that it triggered a lot of other actions. And what we're saying is maybe the NIST, maybe someone else, certainly DHS has a big role in this, but the development of this framework is a place where technology, among other things, people, process, technology, policy, but a place where technology that can be demonstrated to be effective in the ransomware problem specifically can be brought together and made available, or the information made available. And I'll just say, before getting into a couple of points about technology, basics matter. And in many cases, I think the report says a little bit goes a long way. So increasing security in a few key areas can make a significant difference in organizations in an effort to prepare for attacks. For small organizations, expensive, complex security software and complete network rebuilds may not be necessary. Things like multi-factor authentication, adopting password managers, a bunch of different things that are cheap or even free are available, especially to those small organizations, and can become very, very effective, including basic human behavior related actions, with the problem of phishing, which remains one of the most often used initial access methods for ransomware. So, as I like to say, just being suspicious of who's knocking on your digital front door when you weren't expecting the visitor, or looking for the misspellings or the suspicious too good to be true, or demands for urgent action or else. Those type of emails and texts, being suspicious of them can go a long way. And the people in your organization need to understand why these simple basics are so important, and the impact of neglecting them can have on their livelihood in the business. And training is very important here and available at little to no cost. So, and maybe a good point to highlight in here on this phishing thing, following the launch of the task force report, we're seeing a little bit of an uptick in criminal attempts to use the task force leadership, reaching out using our names on spoof phishing emails and asking for your contact information. So for everybody listening, if you see an email or a text from me like that, it's not me. And doing things like rehearsing response procedures. During an emergency is no time to get to know the key players, both inside and outside your organization. So that there are a bunch of things that can be done at a very basic level, let alone the more sophisticated technology that is available and can have an impact in not only helping you with this, but preventing it in the first place.
Yeah, no, I think that's very key. And I think that, the other piece to me that was really important about the way the task force recommendations were structured is also that we recognize that there's a lot of different components to the ecosystem, right? So, two places I want to talk a little bit more about. One is sort of the insurance industry. And Michael, that was, you brought that expertise to the table, but also, recognizing that we needed not just the federal government, but state and local governments to be involved here. So let's talk about, and then the financial industry as well. So there's sort of those three aspects. But Michael, maybe you talk a little bit about how, sort of the insurance industry plays into this.
Sure, I appreciate that, Michael. And cyber insurance as a sector has been a great hope for security professionals for a long time. But we've also been a new industry for a long time. So there's a few hurdles that have prevented cyber insurance from changing behaviors at individual organizations that we've tried to highlight and accelerate the best practices in our task force's report. Thinking forward, and then coming back to the sort of the legacy question, in my view, cyber insurance now is the opportunity. Now is the testing moment. Are we going to help firms both insure themselves against ransomware attacks, but also to help secure the nation more broadly, try to break the cycle that we have here of victims believing they have no choice but to pay ransoms, thus providing the capital for more advanced attacks, which in turn come back to harm us. Now is that testing moment. So the private sector, cyber insurance specifically, is in a great, what we call a hard market in insurance, and I don't mean to nerd out on the particulars with this audience, but what it means is that underwriters should be experimenting constantly to raise underwriting standards, raise requirements for baseline cybersecurity that is tailored to an organization. Feeding off of the last question, it's hard to set a framework that works for everybody that's very prescriptive for every kind of organization about what kind of technologies you should have, what kind of practices you should have. But underwriters are in a wonderful position specific to each organization and to industry classes more broadly to drive best practices, drive better behavior. And in a hard market like we have now, because of the ransomware epidemic, we as an industry are very incentivized to, of course, stem the tide of our clients' losses, stem the tide of our own losses, and drive progress. And so I'm hopeful that two things will happen. One, that underwriters will see the recommendations in our report and use that as a roadmap to improve both their cooperation with law enforcement, with public policymakers, and drive innovation. And second, that insurance properly delivered is a great ballast for this, and that cyber insurance adoption should rise. So when I think back to historically, why hasn't cyber insurance already bent the curve? One problem there is in a weak market which precedes a hard market in our economic cycle. A lot of competitors are inclined to lower their standards to bind more business and be more popular with their clients. Hey, you don't need to have anything with me, that kind of thing, which of course could lead to companies making decisions for themselves to not secure themselves, purely to insure themselves, which is not what we want to see. And then second is the fact that while insurance adoption has had a nice growth trajectory, it's still fairly small. So, and there's still a lot of doubt as to in the marketplace or misinformation about, well, does it pay anything? Does it cover anything? Is it valuable? Is it worth the paper it's printed on? So what I see for the future is that cyber insurance collaborating more closely with government actors, with public policymakers, with law enforcement, thinking more deeply about the systemic role that it plays in a problem like ransomware, which is this tremendous collective action problem, that we can incentivize better behavior, incentivize firms to both insure themselves, but of course secure themselves, and have superior choices than to look at themselves and say we have no choice but to pay a ransom, which of course fuels attacks. So I'm optimistic about the future, but we've got some hurdles ahead of us, and of course it's a competitive marketplace. So I'm hoping that the drives point in the right direction.
Yeah, no, thanks, Michael. I think that's really important. I think Megan, I thought maybe you could talk a little bit, given your work at GCA, sort of with state and local governments in particular. They are very much in the crosshairs of the ransomware gangs and things like that. But that also means that they have a vested interest in, but also a key role in helping to address the problem. And so, how did we think about, can you talk a little bit about how the ransomware task force thought about state and local governments and, the role they might play going forward?
Sure, thanks, Michael. So I would say two or three things about the way the task force thought about this. First, acknowledging that they are really at the pointy end of this, and because of the services that they provide, this also heightens this concern that many of us shared, that leading to this national security threat. The essential services that the states and locals provide on a sort of, the more you have this, the greater the impact on the economy, et cetera. So first, the idea that there's the possibility, or there may need to be the possibility, that states are required to adopt minimum security capabilities around ransomware. And the way that the task force thinks about this is that through the development of this framework, once it's available, that could form a basis against which states could be assessed whether or not they've implemented or begun to implement these processes. That would then potentially allow them to also, the second piece of it is, so either thinking about mandatory minimums almost of baseline cybersecurity capabilities, and then access to funds to help them respond to an incident, hopefully help them, incentivize them to not pay the ransom if they have access to these funds, thereby also disrupting the business model. So you cut off the money, the likelihood the task force thinks that you stop the money, you follow the money, you stop the money, you stop ransomware. The other piece of it, though, I think is there are existing capabilities out there. One of the things that we've talked about already today, but there are a range of resources. There are resources that GCA offers, including through our what's called a small business toolkit, but really it could be useful for any entity, especially small municipalities. But also would encourage them, if they haven't already, to reach out to the multi-state ISAC. There are resources there. The MS ISAC and CIS have expanded the resources that they're offering, not only to state, local, tribal, territorial, but also actually to healthcare and a couple of other sectors that really we're seeing as prime victims in this space because of the critical functions that they provide, and the idea that if they go down, we're in deep goo, to put it not so professionally, and therefore the threat actors think that there's a greater likelihood that they're going to get paid. So those were the, I would say, 2 or 3 things that we wanted to emphasize when we thought about how to manage the risk when it comes to state and locals.
Yeah, and I think, Megan, the other piece that has really struck me over the last few years is, and we've seen this now with the threats to the elections, and now with this ransomware threat, I think that what it shows is that while what we need to be thinking through, and again, this is about process and connections and operations, we need to be thinking through how the federal government can provide more support to state and local governments while respecting their independence, right? And respecting their role in our democracy and in the ecosystem, and leverage that into a strength, right? That you have this vast network of state and local governments that can also provide information back, right? And so that's why one of the recommendations in the task force was to raise that level of information that's being shared on this, so that we on this issue, so that we could have better insight into what's happening and tailor, again, coming back to Philip's point about the the targeting, like, so that we can actually develop better target lists and actually focus the disruption. And state and local governments have to be an active part of that, because they're also a resource to be used. So I think that that's very critical. And then, of course, I want to turn to Philip to talk about the financial system, because that obviously played a huge role in the report's recommendations, particularly cryptocurrencies. And we had a number of recommendations around that, and maybe you can elucidate on sort of why that focus on cryptocurrency.
Yeah, I think and I'd love for Michael Phillips to weigh in on this too. He was really the point person on trying to help figure out what the potential, as we've come to refer to them as these choke points in that payments process, and trying to think about, one of the things that we really see today is that very often technology is now outpacing policy, that the bureaucracy doesn't respond at the same rate of change that we see within industry. And that is without a doubt what you see within the cryptocurrency ecosystem. I don't think there was a single person on the task force that has an issue, for instance, with the blockchain or cryptocurrency or any piece of it. It was more of a, let's get down into how are the malicious actors taking advantage of the gray spaces? How are they finding ways to actually slip through the cracks? And I think the great conversations that we were able to put together with folks from really across the ecosystem, the exchanges, the blockchain analysis companies, those who actually have to engage in the negotiations and understand where the transactions are taking place, getting a sense of where are the weak points. What do you do about a mixer that really prides itself on being a money launderer? What do you do about that? How do you get those signals and warning to the right people in the right amount of time so that they can actually take action? How do you make it so that those data points, whether it's a hash or a wallet address, how do you get that to law enforcement in short order so that they can help you recover your assets and work through processes that I think Michael is much better placed to speak to in terms of how that might work and how we can ramp that up. But I think what was really critical here was understanding that this is a nexus of moving parts We love what folks are doing in that community. And there's I think been some kind of even misunderstanding that, I don't think there's some clarion call that the problem is crypto. I think the issue is trying to find where is compliance being met by those in that ecosystem and where is it not? And what can we do to actually help enforce the regulations that are already in place and make sure that they're as effective as possible? Because as Megan said, the whole point here is to take the money away from these people, to make it so that they are not rolling in cash like they are today. You see videos of these guys in various places, just rolling in cash, and it's abhorrent. And so part of it has to be a focus on how it is that they're getting access to these funds, and crypto plays a huge role in that. So I think we got to ramp up enforcement, but also compliance. Michael, I think you probably have some insights here too.
Yeah, briefly, one of the parts of the report that I am quite proud to highlight is that we attempted to map the entirety of the payment chain from the victim's point of decision of whether to pay the ransom, and of course our focus there. But what do? Where does that US dollar go next? Where does that first, where does that Bitcoin go? Who are all the players involved, and where are those opportunities for targeted intervention? When we consulted with major crypto exchanges, trading desks, blockchain analysis firms, others who are expert and live every day in the cryptocurrency space, what we heard is they don't want crime on their books either. They didn't come here, they didn't want to develop all this wonderful financial innovations to just be used by ransomware criminals who are disrupting U.S. health hospitals. They want it to be used, idealistically for good things. And so, what we tried to do is not lay out a series of, sort of blanket, oppressive regulations on any business that has anything to do with cryptocurrency, but figure out where there could be some targeted opportunities. One that I'll highlight comes back to the one of our broad themes around interagency expertise and unifying that. What we heard from many leaders in law enforcement and policy is that while there are some crypto asset seizure experts, sort of the law of freezing and seizing cryptocurrency, maybe it's sitting on a blockchain or on a cryptocurrency exchange or in a wallet that an financial institution has custody or visibility on. Oftentimes, the law enforcement, tying those knots together so that they could get a viable, defensible court order in time to freeze it and restrict it, bring it back to its victim, it took too long. And so it wasn't happening as often as it could. And so one of our recommendations is to coordinate and centralize that expertise and streamline that process so that our law enforcement can better freeze and seize those kinds of assets. And that's the kind of recommendations that we took tremendous pride in sort of digging through and coming to sort of a really targeted recommendation there. But we were quite pleased to coordinate with a number of cryptocurrency exchanges as we developed our recommendations.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. And I think that as we start to head towards the end of the webinar here, I'll paraphrase what I said at our launch event. Recommending is easy, implementing is harder, to paraphrase George Washington's line from the musical Hamilton. So now what, right? So now what do we do about implementation? How, are there, the task force has already said that we're not going to, continue as, quote, the task force, because that was, not all task forces are meant to live forever. So it does seem like that in Washington, but that, it's not meant to live forever. But now how do we sort of help, implement? And if we're thinking about implementing the recommendations, how should people think about going and doing that? So anybody that wants to jump in on that?
I've got a couple of quick thoughts, and that is, we've issued a call to action. I personally believe that call is going to be answered, but exactly how remains to be seen. And I think the way that participants in the task force can continue to support and help will largely depend on exactly how that call has been answered. We have issued, and I see a lot of questions in here about what's next and timing, and if you take a close look at the report, you see that in each case and each action is accompanied by a proposed timing Some can occur immediately, others over an extended period of time. Others are going to take a longer period to put in place effectively. And we've also recommended who should take the lead and who might be involved in supporting that effort. Those are recommendations that we think, especially since we had government participation in the task force, are pretty realistic. So I would think that, once again, I'm not sure exactly what the task force is going to look like going forward or how the implementation is going to unfold, but I think a lot of it depends on how our call to action is answered.
And I would, as having helped kind of convene this and had really the honor to work with everyone who was on the task force, I would assert that we're already seeing things starting to happen in this vein. You see the Department of Justice standing up its own internal task force. You see DHS really prioritizing this. Secretary Mayorkas spoke about their own internal task force as well. You hear allusions that the White House is going to stand up their own effort focused on this. I don't think that's just in the United States. I think, the Australians are focused on this. The UK is focused on this. The Dutch are focused on this. There is a moment here that can be seized. And I think, with the question of what happens next, what can be easily implemented, how fast can we move on various pieces of this? Shameless plug, reach out via RTF at securityandtechnology.org. We will do things on various recommendations that are in here with folks who are on this call, but also others who are in the community to get after some of the recommendations. But the thing I would really say here, if you have a role in this, get going, say something about it, put your people against it, put more resources against it. This isn't something you should be sitting there and waiting for somebody else to do something about. Don't stand by for the bureaucracy to stand up its task force. Get involved, raise the level of conversation around this, whether you're in a state, a municipality, running a company, you can do something about it right now. You can actually say that this is a problem, and that's something that we all have to be working on. I think one of the reasons I say that is because when we talk about operational collaboration within industry, there were many on the task force who said, yeah, but these guys won't show up. They're working on it internally. They're not going to collaborate. They're focused on their own issues. That's got to stop. If you're actually going to solve this problem, if you run a company, you run a small town, you run a large county, get together with other people who are trying to focus on this and do it now, because I think that's really where the change is going to start to take place.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, Michael, just quickly build on that to say further that as we've talked about, and there are some mentions of this in the report, but there is already a range of resources that can help people take action. You don't need to wait. We know that ransomware is a symptom of a broader problem, and that's poor hygiene. So in many cases, so there are a range of resources. One of the task force's goals is to streamline those resources and make them more available through the framework, but also through housing them in a more accessible place and in more accessible ways. But don't just sit there, do something is the message.
Yep, absolutely. Well, as we start to bring it to a close, I'm going to do kind of a lightning round, around our panelists, for your last words and thoughts that you want to, if there's a message that you wanted to convey, as we continue to engage this. And I'll just certainly say, certainly from the Cyber Threat Alliance perspective, we are going to continue to be engaged on this issue because it is one of the most pressing issues that we face in cybersecurity. It's hard to imagine a more pressing issue in many ways. So I think we will continue to look for all the ways that we can implement the recommendations in the report. But Michael, let me start with you for final round.
Sure, lightning round. Insurers have been studying this problem and trying to insure it for years. They can't keep that wisdom in a silo. They can't. They have to collaborate. So to my brothers and sisters, you got to get into this debate. It's not a private matter anymore.
Right. Thanks, Michael. John?
This is a good report. It's an actionable report. Read it. Find out where you fit and get involved.
All right. Thank you. Philip?
I think I would really just reiterate the last point that I had been making, which is this isn't a problem that faces an organization. This isn't a problem that faces a single municipality or a state. This is a collective action problem. And that's why we recommend high-level government coordination of effort. But that means if you're sitting there and you've got indicators and warning, and you've got IOCs, and you've got things that can be done about this, don't hoard it. Share, collaborate, lean forward, and help your partners out. I think that's one of the most important pieces here.
Great. And Megan, take us home.
I would mostly just +1 what everyone else has said. I think getting engaged and sharing the information that you have is really key to so many pieces of this task force, this set of task force recommendations. So do something.
Well, thanks, everyone. I think I will finish by just saying that I was very impressed by the level of dedication that people brought to this problem from a variety of different backgrounds. And it was really great to see that level of engagement from across a number of different private sector entities, and not just, I mean, I love my cyber nerds that I get to work with all the time, but it was great to have so many different perspectives brought to bear on this problem. And it really, I think, is an example of what really can happen in the ecosystem when people take the initiative to put some organization to it, but also just put their time and effort into it. So I just want to thank each of you for joining on this webinar for the Cyber Threat Alliance and taking the time out of your day to continue to engage on this topic. And we will look forward to, and I will look forward to continuing to work with you on implementing the report. All right. So thanks, everyone. Thanks very much, everyone. And we will sign off.